Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you from Film Fanatic headquarters. Hope everyone's doing good. Thanks again for everyone checking out all the videos. I just did a show where I did a whole show basically on Avatar, just because it was something that wasn't planned on my end. I've been kind of immersed in the James Cameron universe, mainly because I was watching the Alien franchise, and then I finished up that the coverage of that series with Aliens, that the great classic that it is, Aliens, that was directed by James Cameron in 1986. So finished watching that, and then I also did coverage of the Alien box set quadrology, which I did a show just on that, and that show was just focused on the special features aspect that comes along with DVDs and Blu-rays, especially these days, mostly Blu-rays or mostly Blu-ray packages. I'm a huge fan of the special features format and how that whole production side of things has changed. It's not really a thing for regular standard DVDs anymore. Now it's moved to where it's all Blu-rays. I remember seeing that shift originally when I started collecting, when I started to really get heavily into collecting movies, and it still is a thing now, but when I was buying DVDs and I started to really get into buying movies and collecting them and watching them, I would always seek out the copies of those movies that I wanted to get that had, loads of special features, because, I'm a film fanatic, and I love if I if there's a movie I dig or a director I really love, there's nothing more satisfying to me, and I just have so much fun with when a movie has a really great kind of in-depth special features thing of where they'll talk to the director or they'll talk to the cast, but it's not like you know the standard issue kind of thing of where it's just kind of a generic you know synopsis of the movie. It's usually when they go in depth about the film and they get into like their influences, you know, movies that influence those filmmakers, and it's just more in depth. And so I'm a huge fan of that. That's always been my allure for buying movies. And then within the last 10 years, it's really shifted because DVDs are not the thing anymore, as far as they don't have that same power that they had with the emergence of Blu-ray, and then also with 4K there's not as much of a demand. They still make DVDs because they're cheaper to make. But what I started noticing within the last 10 years or less, when I would get newer movies, for instance, I'd rent them or whatnot, they most of them, what I even like to a couple weeks ago when I rented some movies at Opera House Video in Belfast, now it's like this thing of, well, I'll rent a movie on DVD, and a lot of the times they don't have the movie on Blu-ray, but I'll rent a DVD of it, and it will just have like a totally generic kind of special features thing where there's like a 5 minute interview with the director and a 3 minute interview with the actors, and it's just just a general, where they just are generally talking about what the film is. And a lot of DVDs now don't even have that on it. There's occasionally a few DVDs that come out where they'll have like documentaries, but it's super rare. It used to be a thing pretty regularly for virtually almost every new release. And it didn't matter really what style it was. And it's because of DVDs now are not selling like they used to. Now it's a different market, and now Blu-ray is kind of going through that same thing. The boutique specialty DVDs and the companies that are releasing a lot of the grindhouse movies, they're still well, they do it even more. I feel like they pack whatever you buy, you really get your bang for your buck. I mean, if you want some documentaries, if there's a director you love, I mean, forget about it. You'll get oodles and oodles of information. And to me, that's when I see a movie. I still buy movies or Blu-rays of movies that might be super rare or something I've never heard of, or maybe something I saw when I was a kid. And they might, but the prices are so good, and they might not have special features on them, but the artwork is great, and the package itself is great. I'll still buy them for the most part. But usually my priorities as far as buying movies is I'll seek out those that have the full collection of the bonus features. A lot of them come with bonus discs. A lot of the Lucio Fulci movies. I did a show just the other day about Lucio Fulci's The House by the Cemetery. To me, that's a perfect example. I also did a movie review for and talk about Herschel Gordon Lewis's classic, my favorite, overall my favorite Herschel Gordon Lewis movie, Blood Feast. Again, hours of special features, so great. So those are usually when I'm buying new movies, buying new Blu-rays. That's usually what I'll go for. Is I'll look for those primetime packages of where you're getting all of that stuff. So I did a show on my favorite overall collection of special features, and that was the Alien Quadrilogy. Not a huge fan of the other movies after Aliens 2 or Aliens, but the collection of the special features is so in depth and just so interesting. Even for the movies that I don't really like, the documentaries on those movies is just so interesting and revealing and kind of thought provoking. And if you're a fan of the franchise, I mean, it's so awesome. And I've been in the midst of watching the quadrilogy again, and so that's been a lot of fun. So I've had a lot of James Cameron on my mind because of that, and with all the hype with Avatar, the new Avatar movie coming out tomorrow, I believe, or actually opens tonight. I have a lot of mixed feelings about where James Cameron's career has gone, and also I don't know his mode of operation, and how I feel like everybody and their grandmother kind of to a degree kisses his ass to a degree, and I don't really have a real opinion of what Avatar actually is. I feel like it's this mass. I don't know. I feel like there's like this weird mass hysteria around Avatar and the franchise, and I just, I just, So when I did that show, I focused it on just this experience of being bombarded with all of the the ads and everything now related to the franchise of Avatar, and so made me watch the movie again for what it was, the first Avatar, and I've had the same opinion of that movie for a long time, and when I watched it again recently after watching Aliens, I even had a lower opinion of that film. So I figured, why not do a show of where I'm focused on that kind of thing, and it's been on my mind a lot. So that was a cool show to do. Been trying to mix it up with this channel by doing shows, like I guess you call them like specialty shows, where I'm focusing on director. I did Stanley Kubrick show, my favorite director. I did a show just on movie soundtracks. I did a show of just where I focused on reviews, and also how people use social media to either give a movie thumbs up, or to totally trash it, and how that seems to impact the outcome of certain films. So thanks again. I really appreciate people checking out the shows. Something I really love talking about, and there's some new things coming up. I'm setting up some new interview segments for Film Fanatic, so stay tuned for that. That should be fun. That's my favorite out of the different aspects of this channel, with the YouTube channel. With the between the reviews and then the specialty shows, and then a few things of where I'm working on, where it's more music related, particularly tied in with Quantum, my band Quantum. I The interview segments are my favorite. I really enjoy that. So I'm trying to do that more and more, and those have been really fun, and they've been, they seem to get a lot of hits from people. So yeah. So today's show is going to be centered on a movie that I have a super long history with, and it's a really interesting story, or at least for me, I guess. But it's a really interesting story on how I rediscovered this film. I did a show on this movie, and the movie is Madman. This is like one of the best, most underrated. Although now in this kind of last 5 years or so, it's kind of had a renaissance. This was this was a movie. I think this is arguably or definitely one of the best slasher horror exploitation movies that's ever come out. I love this movie to death. The Blu-ray is amazing, and speaking of special features, I mean the artwork is so cool. Speaking of special features, there is so much stuff on here. It's a 2 disc collection. I got this really cheap at Blue Moose, and there's hours and hours of special features on here, and it's really in depth. They talk to the producer, the director, all the actors involved, and this was a really the story about the success of this film is really interesting because initially this movie came out during the whole like slasher craze in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was, part of the whole like horror exploitation world. And a lot of, directors and filmmakers were, because the whole slasher thing ever since Halloween had come out by John Carpenter, you had all of these directors and companies that were trying to capitalize on that, and they didn't have the budget, say, that John Carpenter had, but they were trying to capitalize on and milk that market. So that was during the whole slasher craze. And Mad Men was one of those movies that came out and it totally died. It never really found an audience. It just totally fell under the radar. There was, probably thousands of movies coming out during that time period, in the late 70s to the early 80s. You had so many American slasher movies coming out, so many European slasher movies coming out, or that even had come out. So the market was just bombarded and flooded with so many movies. And this Mad Men, unfortunately, was one of those movies, as well as many other. There's been tons of movies that suffered because of the abundance of these genre films. Mad Men was one that really died initially a quick death. It didn't have an audience. It didn't connect with people. It had a very limited release, and it suffered pretty a great a really unfortunate demise to a degree. But again, with this renaissance that we're living in, as far as all of these companies, reissuing all of these great classic horror exploitation movies. Um, and this is off of Vinegar Syndrome put this out. And Vinegar Syndrome is one of many companies that now reissue all of these great exploitation horror classics, as well as all the great giallo films. This Vinegar Syndrome, Blue Underground, which is probably my favorite. That company was started by Bill Luswig, the director of Maniac, Maniac Cop 1 and 2, many other movies. Maniac being probably my favorite slasher exploitation movie of all time. He retired from filmmaking more or less, and he decided to start his own company, Blue Underground, and they specialize in reissuing all of these great cult classics. So you have Vinegar Syndrome, you have Blue Underground, you have Severin, you have another label that's called Mondo Macabra, which is probably one of my favorites, also probably my second favorite, right behind Blue Underground. They really specialize in a lot of bizarre, um, super uber low budget exploitation movies, like really obscure movies, and they seem to focus on a lot of European movies, and in particular a lot of Asian films that came out in the 70s and 80s. I've been buying more and more titles from Mondo Macabre lately, and they just have such an amazing selection. They're steeped in all of these totally obscure movies, super strange, mostly horror films, fantasy films. So great. And then there's another huge company out there called Severin, which is another really big company that specializes in all things exploitation. Another tremendous company. Another one is Shout Factory. That's another great one. That one is a little bit more on the commercial side. Seem to do more. They do cover and reissue and release lots of the underground kind of exploitation movies, but they also kind of cross over and do more of the films that had a larger budget and had more commercial success in the world, but still a very great company. But I would say Mondo Macabre and Blue Underground really specialize. Well, almost to a degree, Mondo Macabre almost goes kind of, at least out of the companies I've discovered, they kind of take a deeper dive, and they really, I mean, all of the films that I've seen of theirs and that I've bought, and I've been buying quite a few from that label. They seem like they're really ultra obscure movies, and they're amazing. And Blue Underground, like those two companies definitely specialize in the more obscure. One of the greatest things about Blue Underground is they really what Bill Leslie is he's always talked about in interviews and how much he was influenced and is such a deep fan and of Italian horror exploitation movies. But in particularly, he's always talked about how much he loves Lucio Fulci. So they have virtually every movie of Lucio Fulci, of all of his great classic movies. So most of the Lucio Fulci movies I've gotten all come from that label. Just such a great, great company. One of my favorites. And again, made by, that company being created by, easily one, or definitely my favorite slasher exploitation movie of all time. So Madman, this guy right here, sorry the sticker is covering up the top there. This movie came out in 1981, and it was directed by Joe Gione and was distributed by Anchor Bay Entertainment. And it stars Galen Ross, Paul Ehlers, Jan Clare, Harriet Bass, and Mike Sullivan, who plays Madman, plays the killer in the film. And Alex Murphy is also in this. And this film is basically centered on these group of teenagers that go to this cabin in the woods, and there's like this local, like, folkloric tale of this madman who had lived in this area, and he had gone he basically had lost his mind, went totally crazy, and he killed his family and a bunch of other people. And then the townsfolk, kind of a Frankenstein, a little bit based off of the Frankenstein kind of thing to a degree. And the townsfolk found out who the murderer was, and they basically killed, through the whole mob rules thing. They basically got together and killed Madman, the guy who was responsible for all these killings. And ever since then, it's been part of the the local folkloric history of that area, that he is still in these woods and comes back every year and goes on these murderous rampages, and that he basically his spirit comes back and he haunts those woods. And so, like I said in the beginning of the show, I have such a long history of this movie. This was a movie that I saw a bunch of times when I was really, really little, probably, geez, I don't even know if I was in high school. It's probably middle school. And it's a super gory, it's got such great atmosphere. Very, very scary movie, I think. I think legitimately when it comes down to certain horror films, you know, sometimes it's a rare thing when you get generally creeped out by a horror film. Like it could have great kills, have great atmosphere, some great stories, great acting, whatnot. But sometimes it's a rare thing if you strip all that away and you're like, does this movie like actually get under my skin, like legitimately scare me? And I feel like a lot of slasher films, to a degree, they're not necessarily scary that way, but they're entertaining and they're fun in a lot of ways, even though they're super gory. I think like Maniac, like I mentioned, Bill Lustig's epic classic. That movie is super creepy and super disturbing. I remember when I got that movie, I was gonna, and again, that was a movie I had seen when I was a kid, and I bought it on Blu-ray, and I hadn't seen it in 1,000 years, and since I bought it, I've seen it a bunch of times. And I was gonna bring it over. I remember after I watched it, I was gonna bring it over to a friend's house to watch it. But I know that this person that I know, my friend, has a thing about. They like slasher movies, but they have a thing of where they're not really into things I guess you could kind of be considered where it's like torture or like kind of rapey, where there's maybe rape involved in the scenes, and where it's like heavy doses of psychological horror. They have a threshold for maybe like slasher films that are maybe at the Friday 13th level where they're gory and thrilling and fun, but they're kind of campy and they're kind of light in its own terms. And I feel like the Friday 13th movies, I love those to death. It's my favorite franchise. Like I did that big show a couple of months ago. But I think overall, like that movie, that whole franchise, like particularly the tone of those movies, like they're just fun movies. And there's definitely great elements of horror and amazing kills, of course. But I feel like those movies are kind of on a little bit of a lighter side. I don't feel like they don't get into like they don't necessarily get under your skin and they're not like disturbing and kind of like messed up. Like they're super fun and entertaining. I kind of look at them as that. But on the other hand, Maniac, I feel like that movie is there's moments of that movie where it's like really disturbing and you know gets under your skin. And I remember when I bought Maniac, I was gonna bring it over to a friend's house to watch it, because I know they like they don't like the slasher films, but they have a tolerance for it and they're open to those kinds of things. But I think the level that they'll go is the Friday 13th level. And after watching Maniac, I was like, nope, I'm not going to bring this over because this movie is a little bit too messed up. It's definitely disturbing, super creepy. It's kind of next level. It's got this. I don't know. I think the thing about it, kind of reminds me of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where although Maniac is much more of a slasher film and it's much more gory, psychologically, tone wise, it's similar to where it's just got this atmosphere and it's like really disturbing. And I think Maniac, as well as Texas, they both feel like they're kind of like it's real. It's so real and so gritty and dirty and raw and nasty and so sleazy, especially Maniac, that uh, it feels real. So I didn't bring that movie over to watch with a friend because I know they would have been, totally freaked out and not have been into it because it's not definitely not a light movie by any means, especially like the way the beginning and the ending of that film is. It's but Madman, this wonderful movie here. This was a movie I saw a bunch of times when I was a kid. I used to see it. I remember back in the days of VHS. This was a movie I used to rent a lot. I always loved the artwork. It was always, like, ooh, that looks so cool. Like seeing this as a little kid and reading about it. and I used to watch it a lot as a kid, and I always loved it. Uh, and I think it was even on like some horror or cable shows at one point. I remember seeing it on cable a few times, but it was mostly through VHS. By renting it on VHS. And so fast forward many years later, I always retained this thing about Madman. It was particularly around the artwork, and for some reason, it always left an impression to me on me as far as being one of those covers that just grabbed my attention. I love the that whole that whole scene of him kind of standing, of Madman kind of standing in the woods or in the trees with his silhouette. And there was one scene in the movie that always scared me in that film, like generally frightened me as and definitely seeing it as a little kid, of where there's a scene of where Madman he basically wears these overalls. He's this big kind of mountain man, and he wears these overalls, and he doesn't wear any shoes or socks. So his feet, you get all of these scenes, and he uses this giant axe to kill people. And there's a lot of scenes of where you don't really see him, which I think is really effective. You don't really see the actual killer in the movie all that much, and the kill scenes are awesome, pretty gory, and but you don't really see him so much. So he's like always in the shadows, and I always think that that's really effective. It goes back to the whole old school way of doing things. But there's all these scenes in the film where you see him kind of walking or creeping up on people, and you just see his feet, and they're like these dirty. He has these like dirty feet, and you see like the blade of the axe. And there's one scene in particular in the film where there's a group of these kids, these teenagers walking through the woods, and it all takes place in the woods. And the film is super atmospheric. It was shot, I believe, I think it was shot in upstate New York. And the filmmakers really talked a lot about the conditions because I think they shot it during the winter time, so they were like basically freezing their asses off trying to make this movie for like, with no budget. But and they were trying to replicate. It was shot, I believe, in the wintertime in upstate New York, I think. And but the movie was supposed to take place in the summer, like fall, when leaves were starting to kind of change. So they made all of their own foliage, and they decorated the woods with these leaves that made it look like it was in the fall. But meanwhile, it was much colder, and it was further into the winter. But anyway, there's a scene in the movie where there's a group of kids walking through the woods, and all you see like a silhouette of Madman, and you see him kind of standing in this. He's like standing in this tree, and you just see a silhouette of him, but then you see like his feet, and then you see the shine, the glimmer of his axe, and that's all you see. And to me, that was like, I don't know. It's just one of the coolest shots ever I think I've ever seen in a horror film. Like it's super creepy. And he's just kind of in the darkness, and these kids are like walking by, and he's just kind of watching them. And I always thought that was one of the most haunting, creepy scenes I've ever seen in horror history. And I've always had that image imprinted on my head. I've always thought about that that shot, that scene. So fast forward many years later, I completely forgot about this movie. I didn't see it, saw it a few times, maybe like 5 or 6 times when I was a kid. And then fast forward many years later, I started to get really into movies, and I started getting into DVDs, and I started becoming a collector of movies. And then, then I became, you know, an avid collector. And now I'm like, that's part of my life. And it's a thing that I am really invested in, and I became a film fanatic. So, but I always forgot. For some reason I forgot about this movie. I don't know why, but I always had this image in my head. And then about 2 years ago, or maybe less, I started buying. I started buying. It was about 2 years ago now. 2 years ago, where I started really buying all kinds of those exploitation movies that I grew up on, and rediscovering all these movies that I had seen as a kid, and I couldn't be. I was so blown away, but now by that I could now buy these movies on Blu-ray for pretty good prices. They came with special features and great packaging and all the stuff. And then so suddenly I started buying all of those movies, as many as I could, and and then it led to me discovering all kinds of the directors and just really awesome. And then I was um, for some reason that image of Madman had come back to me. I kept because I started watching these podcasts or these YouTube guys. The one guy in particular, Moods from Canada, who I've talked a lot about. He covers all things exploitation, mostly. He's like exclusively kind of focused on those kinds of genres. So by watching his show, I came across a lot of titles that I had seen when I was a kid, and then tons of movies that I had never seen, but just really piqued my interest. And then during that time, I started thinking, "Oh wait, what is that movie?" And then I started getting this vision of that scene of this movie I had completely forgot, which was Madman. But I completely forgot the title, had no idea what it was, and I kept getting that image in my head. And then I started doing, after watching these shows that was doing, I started to try to like figure out what movie it was. And I remember I got in this habit of where I was actually doing, Google searches, which was kind of ridiculous, trying to describe the scene of this movie, which I could not remember for the life of me, uh, to see if that would come up, see if something would come up, and I could not find anything, and it was just like completely frustrating, and I kind of got obsessed around it. But I kept trying. I would even go through a lot of slews. I started looking up other YouTube guys that were also doing coverage of lots of slasher films and exploitation movies, seeing if it would come up with this movie and blah blah blah. And this went on for probably way too long of a period of time where I became kind of obsessed with trying to find this movie that I could not for the life of me think of the title. And that image got stronger and stronger in my head. And after like a few months, I came across one show of a YouTube guy who was talking about the specific period during the early 80s of all of these American slasher movies that had come out. And I came across this one movie where I was like, oh, wait, that looks really familiar. I wonder if that is that movie that I keep thinking about with that one particular scene. And it had a trailer, and he talked about it. And I remember watching the trailer, and it was a real short trailer. It was a really short little clip. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't think it was that. I don't think it's that movie that I'm trying to find. At this point, I was kind of obsessed, probably too much. And I was like, no, I don't think it's the movie. And then a couple of months go by. That same podcast or the same YouTube guy did a review, like a full-on review of this movie called Madman. And then along with the review for for the movie, he also had posted a full trailer, a trailer that was 2 minutes long. The one that he originally had posted was only like, I don't know, maybe a minute or so, and this one was like 2 or 3 minutes, like it was a full length trailer. So then I was like, well, I don't think it's the movie, but I'm gonna give it a shot and see if this is the movie. So I watched it, and then I remember going back to it, and then I watched a couple of scenes, and I saw that scene in a movie, and I was just like, no way, this is the movie. And I had been, kind of obsessed too much about. I was too obsessed about trying to find this movie. It was starting to get aggravating because I got to find this movie because I kept thinking of this image over and over again, especially since I was diving more and more back into the whole horror exploitation world, and that was like on my mind 24/7. And I watched the trailer, and I was like, the longer trailer, and I was like, I think this might be it. And then I ended up going through the trailer almost frame by frame, and I found the actual image that was in my head. I found that scene, and I'm like this. It was like it felt like Christmas morning. It was so weird. I was like, oh, I could hear this chorus in the background. And I'm like, suddenly, this is it. Like, came to this realization after thinking about this movie and doing a lot of work and research trying to find this freaking title. I was like, this is it. And I was like, awesome, awesome. So then I looked up the movie online. I found the title. I was like, this is Madman. It came out in 1981. And I was like blown away. I was like, this is awesome. So it it was or actually, sorry, it came out in 1982. It was a game changer for me. I was super excited. So I wrote the name down and I wrote it so I wouldn't forget it, blah, blah, blah. And then I spent some time trying to find it online to see if it was available, and especially if there was like a Blu-ray collector's edition of the film. And initially I had problems finding it. I had problems finding the movie. There are apparently lots of other movies that are non-horror related that also kind of have that same title. I remember at one point, which was super funny, I got one of the things that kept coming up when I would do these Google searches was Madman, the HBO series about the admin during the 50s and 60s, which is a really cool series, but not at all even closely resembling this movie. That kept coming up, and it was like this is not helping. So I couldn't, for some reason I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it online, and I knew it was like a pretty obscure movie, but I had the title down. I was like, okay, this is the movie. And then I remember another couple times I looked it up, and then I found it. I found this movie, I think on Amazon or some other company online that sells movies, but I think it was Amazon. And I was like, oh, this is it. This is it. I found Madman, and I looked it up and I looked into buying it, and it was really expensive. It was super uber expensive, and I was like, shit. I think it was maybe 40 or $50, and I was like, oh man, that's crazy. I'm not going to spend that much money on this. And then a couple weeks later, I looked again, and then I found a copy of it online, and I think it was eBay, Amazon, one of those companies. I can't remember, and it was really cheap. But it was also I was looking for the special features one, the one that I was seeking out originally with the special features to see if that was available. The one that I came across was uber expensive. And then a few weeks later, I found it online, and I found the same exact movie. It was a collector's edition. It had all kinds of bonus features. It was 2 discs, and I found it, and it was really cheap. And then I ordered it, and then I got it, and I was so excited. It felt like Christmas morning when I finally got the movie. And since then, I bought it, and I've watched it many many times. There's so many. Since I bought it, I've seen it dozens and dozens of times. I love this movie. Love this movie to death. The special features are super fascinating. And like I said in the beginning of the show for my coverage of Mad Men, the this was one of those movies like commercially when it came out, and again it's uber low budget, but it's I think one of the best horror slasher exploitation movies in the history of that amazing genre. It bombed. It went into total obscurity. It didn't really have any. I don't believe it wasn't in the theaters very long. It didn't really find an audience. It kind of got washed. It got caught up in the whole frenzy of the 70s and 80s where there were so many movies that came out. It just kind of fell by the wayside. It never found an audience. It never really did anything. So then years and years later, there's all these interesting interviews with the producers and people who acted in the film as well as the director. Where years, I don't think it was like 15, 20 years later, maybe 20 years later, that suddenly a lot of the filmmakers were and people that were involved with the film, were getting were where they were getting these messages and emails from strangers about, when is Madman going to come out on Blu-ray, or when is there going to be a 4K version, or is there going to be a sequel? Because initially, I think they talk about it in the franchise, like in the origins of the movie, the filmmakers, where they had intended on trying to make this into a trilogy and to try to make it into a franchise. But the first one didn't do very well at all. It just fell into this total obscurity. So obviously, they had no financial backing to go ahead and make another one. So suddenly, these guys that are talking about all of this kind of stuff and special features, they were talking about how they just started getting these like random emails and messages through Facebook about, when is this movie ever going to get put out on Blu-ray, and is there still a possibility that there could be a sequel? And then before they knew it, they were like inundated with all of this information. Suddenly, they came across these websites. There was this total like cult following that evidently had grown like totally on the underground circuit of for these films by these fans that were, obviously checking this movie out and telling their friends, and this whole kind of underground kind of movement emerged, and there was this whole demand for this film. And then it spurred on the release by Vinegar Syndrome, which is, one of the most popular, one of the biggest companies, if arguably might be the biggest company as far as companies that reissue movies. And this was picked by Vinegar Syndrome due to lots of demand by fans to get, a serious royal treatment and to bring this movie back. And then this movie was released, I believe it came out just a few years ago. And since then, the people involved with the film on the special features disc, talking about since then, they're so busy with going to like all these horror conventions, and suddenly there's like all this buzz around this movie on how this movie was, totally forsaken during its time of its initial release, never how it never found audience. But now there was like, like I said, we're kind of living in a renaissance as far as all of these beautiful packages coming out and reissues of all these great movies that are totally obscure, some more obscure than others, and they're finding their audience. And this was an example. Like this movie suddenly started to make money for the filmmakers, and now these guys were, in their respective styles or genres, were being treated, like royalty to a degree. And they were talking about how they started going to all these conventions and they do all these signings, and like all of a sudden they're like, wow, like we had no idea that there were people, that folks were into this movie. And it's a really rabid kind of, cult fan base. And so now years and years later, they've, the people who made this movie are actually making profit off of the film, when initially they didn't make anything. So it's pretty amazing, like, total grassroots kind of cult movement where you just have a group of people that, are avid collectors of certain films, and they just seek out, this movie, that movie, and then something really piques their interest, and then it just spreads, and it just spreads and spreads, and things get shared. A lot of it is due to social media too, which I think is one of the greatest attributes of social media. Word of mouth and word of mouth, and people building websites and also discussion boards and communicating. It's a lot easier to communicate these things. So through that, the whole film grew, and now it's like looked at as a cult classic, and it's pretty amazing the journey that this film has been on. There's a couple interviews also with some people who were part of this whole kind of movement to get this movie reissued, and there's a couple of guys on there that are like I mean they're so steeped in all things horror, and like where they know everything about every obscure horror movie that's ever come out, as far as American films, European films, Italian films. Like they're encyclopedias, and they were taught. And this one guy in particular was saying, yeah, this was a movie that he felt needed to get this treatment, and he was one of the people kind of responsible with really pushing for getting this movie made, and he's like a hardcore fan. So it was really interesting. It kind of became its own albeit small, but it became its own kind of phenomenon of a movie on a on a very underground in a very underground situation, but it's made money and it's pretty amazing. And I think that is another reason that we're living in a pretty amazing time as far as all these gems that were buried under the dirt for so long. Now we're getting these audiences, and now like these, which the coolest part is now a lot of these filmmakers can actually make a profit off of a movie that they did 30 years ago or something. It's just it's wild. It's totally amazing. And the transfer of this on this for this package is amazing. It's all remastered. The video is just incredible. It was all shot originally on film, so it still retains the grittiness of the original. It was remastered digitally from the original negative, so the quality is just amazing. The music is really amazing for this film too. Really great electronic, synth stuff. That's all remastered. Just such an awesome movie. It's definitely like a combination of where I feel like it's definitely entertaining, but the atmosphere is so great for this film that I think it generally, and it's got these scenes in it and certain things about the film that are generally super creepy, so it kind of brings it to a different level. The kills are great. I just love this movie so much. So this was one of my favorite movies that I recently got, and then I was able to finally track down this film and also really kind of relive my part of my years as as a kid through watching this and owning this on Blu-ray. Fabulous movie. So I highly recommend Madman, 1982, one of the greatest slasher exploitation movies ever. And it's now, fortunately, now it has finally found an audience. So this is Jason Dean. So thanks again for checking out this channel. Stay tuned for some more shows. If you like this page and and enjoy listening to me rant about these weird movies, please like and subscribe to my channel. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.